So big difference here. So let's sort of summarize our findings here. This is the important piece of this. So if we compare y equals ax squared plus bx plus c, where a is greater than 0, so a is positive, versus y equals ax squared plus bx plus c, where a is negative, then we have two very different graphs. So this is kind of going to be a rough sketch here. Draw some XY plane here. All right, so we have two parabolas. One of them, let's say, looks like this, and our other one looks like that. So notice when a is negative, we have a frowny face. When a is positive, we have a happy face. So that's a good way to remember what way your parabola will open. In terms of our other pieces, the axis of symmetry is right there, and we're going to label that. So our axis of symmetry, which will always be x equals something. We have our vertex. And in the case of the happy face, it's a max. In the case of a frowny face, I'm sorry, I said that backwards. In the case of a happy face, it's a minimum value. In the case of a frowny face, it's a maximum value. So that one's a little backwards. We have our y-intercept here, right, wherever it crosses the y-axis. And those are really the key features that I want you to learn here. So just to summarize in words as well, our characteristics, we say the graph opens up if a is positive and down if a is negative. We also have that the graph is narrower. So remember our first example, graph is narrower when, this is a funky way to write this, but when the absolute value of a is greater than 1. So if it's bigger than 1, and we say the absolute value because if it's negative, then we get into that flip-floppy thing. So we can't just say a is bigger than 1 because negative 2 still makes a narrower graph than a value that's under 1. So then we can say, and wider if, again, absolute value of a is this time less than 1. So if it's any kind of decimal, like 1/2, 1/3, 1/4, that kind of thing, it just has to be less than 1. We also have, we actually have a rule for the axis of symmetry and for the vertex and y-intercept, but I'm going to put that down here. So these are the things that you're going to use for your homework assignment. Our axis of symmetry. And I really like that abbreviation, AOS. I use that most of the time. The axis of symmetry is x equals, and then it's this formula here, negative b over 2a. And just as a reminder, where that b and a business comes from, y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. So when we talk about letters, talking about the number the number before x squared, the number before x, and then your last number. Those are your a, b, and c. We also have a rule for the vertex. The vertex comes from your axis of symmetry. It's going to be the ordered pair negative b over 2a. So the axis of symmetry is the x part of that. And the y part of that is when you plug in the axis of symmetry into your function, that will be your y for the vertex. And we'll go through that example as well. Then we have that the y-intercept, this one's a little easier. Remember, it's always just 0, c. That one's real easy. And then our domain The domain's nice. It's negative infinity to infinity. Our range is a little trickier. So the range will be our minimum y to max y. Okay, so that one is going to be a little trickier. So those are the 4 rules that we're going to be working with. Let's do one more example where we don't make a table. So all I'm going to do for this example is I'm going to go in order and I'm going to use my key features. So I'm going to use my axis of symmetry, I'm going to use my vertex, and I'm going to use my y-intercept. So I usually start by saying, okay, first of all, I like to write down the formula, so I have it right there. Actually, I should say x equals, because let's not be lazy. X equals negative b over 2a. So this is my a, this is my b, this is my c. Notice for b is actually negative 8. So a equals 2, b equals negative 8, and c equals 6. So when I plug this in, I have x equals negative, and then we have another negative 8 over 2 times 2. So don't forget this negative goes along even if your b is already negative. You need to put both. So when you simplify this, negative times a negative becomes a positive, so we have 8 over 4. So our axis of symmetry is x equals 2. So the vertex formula, our vertex formula is that negative b over 2a, and then it says plug in your negative b over 2a into the equation, and that's going to be your y value. So let's say this is my f of x, right? I'm using y, but it is my f of x. So now I'm going to say f of 2, which equals 2 times, instead of x, I put 2 squared, oops, not plus, minus 8 times 2 plus 6. When I plug this in, I have 2 times 4 minus 8 times 2 is 16 plus 6. This is 8 minus 16 plus 6, which means that f of 2 is equal to negative 2. Yeah, negative 2. So that means my vertex, if I fill in this information, is 2 comma negative 2. And then the y-intercept, our easiest part, is just 0 comma c. So our y-intercept is 0 comma 6. All right, so we have 3 key pieces of information, and we're going to use those to graph with no table. So I draw my xy. I'm not sure why I didn't give you an xy coordinate already. Again, I'm going to count by 1, so I'm not going to label it. So my axis of symmetry is at x equals 2, so I'm going to draw a dotted line at x equals 2. My vertex is at 2, negative 2, so I go over 2, down 2. I can see that my a is positive, so this is going to be an upward facing parabola. My y-intercept is at 0 comma 6, so 3, 6. All right, so I need at least 3 points to make a parabola. But remember, the axis of symmetry says that the distance between this point and the axis of symmetry is the same as this point and the axis of symmetry. So that means my other point is right there. So then I can draw my parabola. Sorry, I'm not good at drawing with this Apple Pencil. Do your best, though. So that is my parabola right there. I have all of my important pieces of information labeled. And then I can go on to say the domain is negative infinity to infinity. And my range here, my minimum value here, comes directly from the vertex. My minimum value is negative 2 to positive infinity. So the homework assignment deals with this. You have all week to do this homework assignment, but ideally you'll have it done within the first 2 days so that you can ask me any questions about this section.